She couldn't see the faces, only feel the jeers. The sack over her head was coarse burlap, rubbing her cheeks raw with each jolt of the wagon. They hadn't even let her walk. Just tossed her up like cattle. She'd tried screaming once, but that only earned her a cracked rib and the promise of worse. So she stayed quiet now. Not from fear, but survival. They thought if they couldn't see her face, she'd be easier to sell. "Less trouble that way?" one of the men muttered. But Nora was more than trouble. She was fire covered in dust, breath still burning in lungs no one had asked to hear. She didn't even know the name of the town they'd dragged her to. Somewhere west, somewhere forgotten, somewhere cruel. The auction yard smelled like sweat and old tobacco. Voices rose in lazy amusement. "What's under the sack?" someone called. "Hope she ain't cross-eyed." Laughter. A hand yanked her forward. $15. She's strong, young, perfect for field work or breeding, if that's your need." The auctioneer's voice was practiced. The words made her stomach twist. And still, no one pulled the sack. Her wrists were bound in front of her, ankles bruised from rope. She thought of her mother, how she used to braid Nora's hair while humming about a future they never reached. Then the bidding began. Fast, cheap, dehumanizing. 17. 20. 25. A man near the front said, "I'll take her for 30 if she's quiet." The auctioneer raised his gavel, when suddenly a voice cut through the heat. "That's my wife." The yard went silent. The gavel paused mid-air. "Who said that?" the auctioneer barked. Nora's breath caught. She couldn't see, but every cell in her body turned toward the voice, a shuffle of boots. Then, "Take that sack off her head." "She don't belong here." The cloth ripped away, light stabbing into her eyes. She blinked, disoriented. The crowd blurred. But one man stepped forward, tall, lean, his coat dusty, his face unreadable, except for the rage in his eyes. "I said," he repeated slowly, "she's my wife." The auctioneer laughed nervously. "Is she? She don't seem to recognize you." "She's been through hell. Doesn't change who she is." Nora stared at him. She didn't know his name, had never seen him before in her life. But something in his voice said safety. Something in his lie felt more like truth than anything else in years. And when the crowd began to murmur, she did something she hadn't done since the day they took her. She nodded. Just once. And whispered, "Yes." "I'm his." Nora didn't know why she'd said it. She just knew that if she hadn't, they would have dragged her back to the wagon like an animal. And the man who'd stepped forward, he hadn't flinched. Not when the crowd turned hostile. Not when the auctioneer barked, "Papers are proof, mister?" He stood tall, hands still at his sides, voice calm as a thundercloud. "You want papers? I'll bring you the man who forged the ones that put her here. He's in this crowd, I'd bet on it." A ripple of unease passed through the buyers. That kind of accusation, that kind of confidence, it meant he knew something, or at least made them believe he did. Nora's heart hammered in her chest. She had no idea who this man was, or why he'd spoken for her, but he hadn't looked away once. Not from her bruises, not from the rope burns on her wrists, not from the shame the sack had tried to erase. Finally, the auctioneer raised his hands. "Fine, take her. But if you're lying, I won't stop the sheriff from doing what he has to." The man simply nodded and reached into his coat, tossing a few coins at the ground. "Then consider this my last bid." He walked to her slowly, deliberately, and knelt to cut the rope at her ankles. She wobbled as he stood. "Can you walk?" he asked. She swallowed hard. "Yes." He didn't touch her, just stepped aside and said, "Then let's go." They walked through the crowd like a spark, leaving dry grass behind. No one dared stop them. Maybe they thought she'd scream. Maybe they hoped he'd turn violent. But Nora just walked, holding her head as high as her pain would let her. At the edge of town, past the last post of the auction yard, she finally broke her silence. "You lied." He nodded. "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her then, for the first time really seeing her, and said, "Because I saw your hands shake under that sack. But your knees never buckled. That means something." "You don't know me," she whispered. "I don't need to," he replied. "I just needed them to stop." The wind tugged at her torn sleeves. She wanted to collapse, to run, to disappear. But something in her chest stayed upright. This man didn't ask for her name. He gave her one instead. Wife. And in a world that had tried to sell her as nameless, that was the first thing that felt like freedom. He led her down a narrow trail that wound behind the town, away from wagons and eyes, and the scent of burnt meat that clung to auction yards. Nora didn't speak again. Her feet ached, her knees throbbed, but her mind spun faster than the sky above. She walked beside a man who had lied to save her, and somehow that lie had steadied the ground beneath her more than any truth in recent memory. After an hour of silence, he stopped by a shallow stream shaded by cottonwoods and knelt to fill his canteen. Without looking at her, he asked, "You hungry?" Nora hesitated, not sure if it was a trap. Then she nodded. He pulled 2 biscuits from a cloth pouch and handed her one without ceremony. "You got a name?" he asked finally. "Nora," she said quietly, chewing the word like it might vanish if spoken too loudly. "Nora what?" "I don't know anymore." That made him look up. His face wasn't kind in the gentle sense, but it was strong, anchored. "Then you can borrow mine, for now." She blinked. "You haven't told me yours. Call me Dane." Just that. No apology, no story. Just a man who had stepped in when no one else had dared. "Why did you do it?" she asked again. "Really?" Dane's eyes moved to the water, reflecting more sky than self. "Because when I was a boy, they took my sister. Sold her the same way. I was too small to stop it. But I swore I'd never let it happen again." The pain in his voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp, buried in the gravel of his tone. "Did you ever find her?" Nora whispered. He shook his head once. "No." That silence stretched between them, wide but not empty. Nora felt her own rage rise, not against him, but against the world that had carved so many names off women like worn tombstones. "You risked everything for a stranger," she said. "I ain't risking anything," Dane replied. "You were the one who stood there and didn't fall apart. You did the hard part. I just gave it a name they couldn't argue with." Nora looked at her hands, still trembling, but something in her chest was beginning to still. She wasn't his wife. But today, for the first time in forever, someone had claimed her with something better than money, with action, with honor, and maybe, just maybe, with a reason to stand up again. By nightfall, they reached a clearing tucked deep into a grove of pine and cottonwood, the moon rising slow above the ridge. A small cabin stood there. Nothing grand, just a one-room shelter with a slanted roof, shuttered windows, and a front porch that creaked with every wind gust. Dane nodded toward it. "I built this after my sister vanished. Thought if she ever found her way back, she'd need a place to land." Nora hesitated at the threshold. Her body ached. Her dress clung to her, damp with sweat and dirt. She didn't feel like someone worthy of a safe place. "It's yours now," Dane said gently. "Just until you figure out what you want next." She stepped inside slowly. The room smelled of cedar and ash. A single cot sat against the wall, layered with a wool blanket. A pot hung over the cold hearth. One shelf held a tin cup, a spoon, and a battered Bible. But it was clean. Real. Untouched by cruelty. "You're not going to lock the door behind me?" she asked, without turning. "No," he said. "But if you want to lock it yourself, I left the bar leaning by the window." That answer stunned her more than any kindness ever had. Trust wasn't a thing she was used to. It had always been currency, traded, twisted, or betrayed. But Dane didn't ask for anything. He just saw her worth when no one else had. She sat on the cot and stared at her hands, the bruises on her wrists already beginning to purple. Dane crouched by the hearth, striking a flint until a small flame bloomed. "There's stew in the cellar," he said. "I'll fetch it." She watched him leave, and something inside her broke, not from fear, but from the ache of being cared for without condition. When he returned with a pot of stew and placed it beside the fire, she whispered, "I don't know how to trust this." Dane stirred the pot slowly. "You don't have to, not now. Just eat, rest, heal, that's enough." The simplicity of it nearly brought her to tears. Not love, not promises, just space to be human again. They didn't speak much as they ate. But that silence wasn't empty. It was full of 1,000 things that didn't need explaining. She wasn't his wife. But tonight, in a cabin built for the lost, she was no longer for sale. No longer nameless, and no longer alone. Nora woke to bird song and the warmth of morning sunlight streaming through the cabin's cracks. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, no one stood over her. No orders barked, no footsteps circling. Just quiet. Just breathe. Her own. She sat up slowly, the stiffness in her limbs reminding her of the weeks, maybe months, spent bound, transported, degraded. But this body, bruised as it was hers again. Outside, she heard the soft rhythm of an axe splitting wood. She rose, stepped to the door, and there he was. Dane, sleeves rolled up, sweat lining his brow, methodically cutting logs without looking her way. He didn't treat her like a guest, or a burden, or anything less than an equal. She stood on the porch, unsure what to say. "You sleep?" he asked without turning. "I did," she replied. "First real sleep in I don't know how long." He nodded. "Good. No questions, no pity, just that." She sat on the step and watched him work. His movements were steady, almost meditative, and each swing of the axe seemed to beat away at the lingering parts of her that still expected chains, still anticipated cruelty. "Can I help?" she asked. Dane looked at her, not with surprise, but assessment. Not whether she could, but whether she wanted to. He handed her a hatchet without hesitation. "You split the kindling, over there." It wasn't easy. Her arms trembled, her palms burned, but each crack of wood felt like a declaration. She wasn't the girl with the sack on her head anymore. She was Nora, and Nora could swing an axe. Later, they drank water from the stream and sat beneath a tree. "You don't talk much about where you came from," Dane said, not probing, just observing. "Because it doesn't matter anymore," she replied. "That girl, the one they dragged onto that platform, I buried her." He didn't argue, didn't push, just said, "Then I'm glad I met the one who rose instead." She blinked against sudden tears, not because of the words, but because of how he said them. No flattery, no claim, just truth. That evening, she bathed in the stream alone while Dane tended the fire. She scrubbed every inch of herself with rough soap and washed away not dirt, but shame. And as the stars blinked to life above the trees, Nora looked at her reflection in the water. For the first time, she didn't flinch. She didn't see what others had used. She saw a woman. Alive. Whole, unowned, and free. The next time they went into town, it wasn't to run or to hide. Dane needed supplies, rope, beans, a new blade for his plow, and he asked without hesitation, "You coming?" Nora looked up from the broom she was using to sweep the porch. The question felt like an invitation and a challenge at once. She could have stayed behind, unseen. But she nodded. Yes. She dressed in the plainest skirt she had, her sleeves rolled high from work, her hair tied back in a knot. The bruises had faded, but the memory of that sack still hovered just beneath her skin. Still, she mounted the wagon beside Dane and didn't flinch when they passed the auction yard. The post was still there. The platform, too. But this time, no one could put her back on it. The town felt smaller now, or maybe she had grown. Heads turned when they entered the general store. Miss Calder stiffened behind the counter, her eyes flicking to Dane, then to Nora, then back. "Good morning," Dane said plainly. "We need flour, sugar, and 3 yards of twine." "And the lady?" Miss Calder asked, forcing a tight smile. "I'd like some thread," Nora answered calmly, "and fabric if you've got something not meant for mourning." There was silence, then a slow nod. "We might." No one laughed, no one whispered, because the way Dane stood beside her said everything. This woman is not alone. This woman will not be touched. When they left, Nora noticed the baker's wife watching her from the doorway. The same woman who had bid on her weeks ago, eyes cold with the convenience of cruelty. Now those same eyes dropped away. Power had shifted, even if no one dared say it. On the ride back, Dane handed her a small parcel. "Picked it up when you weren't looking." She opened it to find a thin silver comb. Nothing ornate, just solid. Real. "Why?" she whispered. "Because when you walked in today," he said, "you didn't look afraid. That deserves something." Nora didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply ran her fingers over the comb and tucked it into her pocket. A woman in her own skin. A woman who no longer needed to be claimed by anyone, but allowed herself to stand beside someone who chose her without possession. And as the wagon rolled toward the cabin, she didn't look back at the town. Because she didn't belong there. She belonged where truth wasn't loud, but it was steady. Where safety wasn't promised, but earned. Where she could breathe without apology. A week after their visit to town, a stranger rode up the trail near the cabin. Nora was hauling buckets from the stream when she spotted the dust first, then the glint of a polished belt buckle. Dane was working in the garden, and she didn't call for him. She didn't run. She just stood straight and watched the man approach. He was young, dressed too fine for a frontier trail, and the smirk on his face told her everything. He wasn't there by accident. "Afternoon," he said smoothly. "This the Ward homestead?" Nora nodded once. "Who's asking?" "Name's Lyle. I work for a man who remembers you." Her throat tightened, but she didn't let it show. "Then he should have remembered I don't belong to him anymore." Lyle chuckled, leaning forward in the saddle. "You see, that's the thing. He says you left owing him something. Claims he paid good money." Nora didn't blink. "He bought silence, obedience, and a girl with no choices. None of that's for sale anymore." Lyle tilted his head. "Brave talk. You think that cowboy behind the axe can protect you forever?" "He didn't save me," she said. "I did that." Lyle was taken aback, not by the words, but by the way she said them. No tremble, no hesitation, just steel. Dane appeared then, silent as a shadow, one hand on the handle of a hoe. "You're trespassing," he said flatly. "And if you're threatening her, you're not leaving with your boots." Lyle glanced between them, weighing odds. Nora stepped forward, just enough that the man had to meet her eyes again. "Tell your boss if he wants something from me, he can come ask himself. But I won't be gagged, leashed, or covered again. I know who I am now." Lyle pulled his reins. "You'll regret talking like that." "No," she said, her voice clear. "I regret not saying it sooner." He left without another word, dust in his wake. Nora stood there, chest rising and falling, until Dane gently touched her arm. "You didn't need me," he said. "Not this time. I needed you to stand behind me, not in front of me." Dane smiled, a rare, quiet thing. That night they sat on the porch under a sky bruised with stars, and Nora didn't need to be held or comforted. She just needed the space to feel what she'd done, to remember the voice she'd buried, and to know, beyond any doubt, that it would never go silent again. The summer deepened, and with it, so did the life Nora had never thought she'd live. She woke with the sun and worked until her muscles ached. Not because she was forced, but because every nail she hammered and every seed she planted rewrote the story of her body. A body once sold, now strong, capable. Her hands, once tied and bruised, now shaped the cabin into something more than shelter. She mended the roof with Dane, taught herself to stitch curtains from old grain sacks, and even carved a small shelf for her thread and comb. When she cut her palm one morning on a splintered plank, she didn't cry out. She wrapped it in cloth, looked at the blood, and felt a strange pride. Pain, now, was honest. Not punishment, but proof of work. That evening she prepared dinner alone, rabbit stew, fresh bread, and a boiled root she'd pulled herself. Dane came in from the fields, dust on his face, and paused at the table. "You've done all this?" She nodded. "You don't have to cook every night," he said. "I know." "Then why do you?" Nora wiped her hands on her apron. "Because it's the first time I've ever made something that stayed mine when it was finished." Dane didn't speak. He just sat and ate, and with each bite, she felt something settle inside her. Not romance, not need, but respect. Later that week, a neighbor rode by, an older woman named Mabel, who'd heard rumors of a girl once auctioned and now unrecognizable. She came bearing eggs and suspicion. Nora served her tea on the porch and answered every question with quiet strength. "And you two?" Mabel asked, eyes narrowing. "You're married, then?" Nora didn't look at Dane. She said, "We're building something. Name or not, it's real." Mabel sipped her tea, studied her for a long moment, then said, "You speak like someone who earned her place." "I didn't earn it," Nora replied. "I reclaimed it." When Mabel left, she glanced back once and said, "Some women take years to find their spine. You seem to have stitched yours back together fast." Nora didn't reply. She didn't need to. That night, as she washed the dishes by lantern light, she saw her reflection in the cabin window. Not the shadow she once was, but a woman standing in her own shape, her back straight, her chin lifted, her hands marked by effort, not violence. She was no one's property, no one's secret. She was Nora, and every beam of that cabin now carried her name, whether carved in wood or not. It was the first Sunday she'd returned to town since that awful day at the auction. No sack, no escort, no fear, just her. Hair braided tight, sleeves rolled to her elbows, and the smallest silver comb tucked into her dress pocket. Not for show, but as a symbol. She walked beside Dane, but she wasn't clinging to his shadow. She moved step for step with him, and everyone saw it. At the general store, people paused mid-conversation. A few lowered their voices, and some even nodded politely. But Nora didn't come for their eyes or approval. She came for thread, for sugar, for freedom. And because it mattered to be seen standing upright where she'd once stood in shame. As they loaded the wagon, Dane asked gently, "You want to stop at the chapel?" She shook her head. "Not yet. I don't need their blessing to know I'm whole." But just as they turned to leave, they heard shouting down the road, a commotion by the old auction post. A young girl, barely 16, was being pulled by the arm by a man twice her size. She didn't scream, just stumbled, defeated, like screaming had been punished too often. Dane moved first, but it was Nora who stepped between them. "That girl's not yours," she said, voice flat. The man laughed. "You think she wants your kind of help?" "I don't think," Nora replied. "I remember." She turned to the girl. "Do you want to leave?" The girl blinked, lips trembling, unsure if the question was even allowed. Then nodded. Just once. The man lunged, but Dane was there, calm and solid. "You'll want to think twice," he said, hand hovering near his belt. A deputy appeared from the saloon steps, chewing calmly. "Everything all right here?" "She's not his," Nora said. The girl clung to her now. The deputy looked at Nora, at the girl, at the man's bruised ego boiling in his red face. "Then she walks away," the lawman said, "and he rides out." And just like that, another life was reclaimed. Back at the cabin, the girl barely spoke, but she helped chop carrots, fetched water, and stared at Nora like she was something impossible. That night, as the fire crackled and the sky stretched wide above them, Dane turned to Nora. "You didn't wait for someone to choose you this time." She smiled faintly. "Because I finally realized I was never waiting to be chosen. I was just waiting to choose myself." And in that moment, with the quiet flicker of firelight on her skin and a young girl safe inside, Nora knew the cycle had broken. Because she had broken it, with nothing but her voice and her will. The cabin wasn't grand. The roof still leaked in storms, the floorboards creaked, and the garden sometimes yielded more weeds than food. But it was hers. Every nail, every bruise on her palms, every stitch in the curtains. Hers. Nora no longer counted time by how many days had passed since the auction. She measured it by how many lives she'd helped steady. The girl she'd pulled from that man's grip, Anna, had stayed. She slept by the hearth and helped collect firewood. She didn't speak much at first, but one day she laughed when a goat knocked over the laundry, and it echoed through the trees like something sacred. That laugh was a kind of healing Nora hadn't known she needed. Dane built another room on the cabin with Nora's help, never calling it hers or his, just ours. They never spoke vows, never needed a preacher. What they had wasn't declared in public. It was written in morning chores, silent meals, and the way his hand sometimes found hers under the table. It was in how he never flinched when she spoke her mind, and how she never waited for his approval to speak. One day, word came from town. A new law had passed. No more human auctions. Not because of one protest, not because the system had grown a conscience, but because too many women like Nora had stood up, refused to be unnamed, and burned down the silence that protected cruelty. Mabel came by that week with news and bread. She placed the loaf down and said, "They talk about you in town now. Say you started something." Nora just shrugged. "I didn't start it. I just refused to be ended." Mabel smiled, slow and warm. "Well, whatever it was, you made them look in the mirror." That night, Dane carved a new piece of wood. Not for fire, for the gate. When Nora saw it, she froze. The carving read, "The Ward Place, home of the woman who wasn't bought." She touched the letters, fingers trembling. "It's too much," she whispered. "It's the truth," Dane replied. "Let them see it." Years later, they said the woman who lived in that cabin helped rewrite what the frontier allowed. She'd been sold, silenced, stripped of her name. But none of it stuck. Because she stood back up. Because she said no and then lived like it mattered. And when they tell her story now, they don't start with the sack. They start with the moment she said, "I'm his," and meant, finally, "I am my own."